Hello everyone, and my name is Natxo Navarro, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Murcia in Spain. And first of all, thanks to organizers for proposing this fund for the prize finalists, and also many thanks to Naples for participating in this one. And also, of course, thank you all as well for being here in the very last hours of the conference. My presentation will be structured as follows. My main objective in this article is to challenge what I call the reflective experience condition, or REC, as I will call it. Namely, this is the widespread assumption that attentiveness is a necessary condition of everyday aesthetic experience. Against this view, I will support that everyday aesthetic experience could take place undotted while, that is, when we remain in the reflective attitude permeating ordinary everyday life. And for this purpose, in the first part, I will be introducing REC and expressing my concerns about it. In the second section, in line with my purpose, I identify a recurrent but undoubtedly idea in the literature suggesting against REC that everyday life is a aesthetic experience somehow reflective. And I refer to this idea as the intuition on everyday aesthetics. The intuition on everyday aesthetics under the term. Then in the third part, which is the core of this work, I proceed in two steps. On the one hand, I question REC by showing that it relies on a contested view of perception as requiring attention. Thus, as underlying the aforementioned intuition, I consider the possibility that perception could also be inattentive. On the other hand, however, I claim that discussions in everyday aesthetics have been cast too much in psychological terms. In this vein, my main argument proposes reconsidering the reflective character of everyday aesthetic experience in terms of the normativity traditionally associated with aesthetic judgment as an expression of our rational agency. So, let's go with the first part. The ordinary experience we have of everyday life is marked by an unreflective attitude characterized by a general lack of awareness, meaning that we tend not to pay much attention to the actions we carry out and the objects and environments around us. Yuriko Saito offers a great description of this unreflective attitude by comparing our usual way of operating in everyday life with conducting on autopilot. Essentially, she characterizes this attitude as an attitude that puts the ingredients of everyday life beyond captured by our conscious power. Here, I brought a few references merely to illustrate how ordinary everyday experience is often characterized by such an unreflective attitude in the literature. However, to move forward more quickly, I will skip them, although we can come back here later if we have time and if you want to. The first main point of my presentation is what I call the reflective experience condition. And with this I refer to an extended view according to which everyday aesthetic experience requires abandoning such an everyday reflective attitude to attend either temporarily or simply because something attracts our attention to aesthetic aspects of everyday life. In other words, as mentioned, this is the view that attentiveness is a necessary condition of everyday aesthetic experience. And again, we can find Saito clearly illustrating this view. And in her words, we can read that being aware and paying attention is simply a prerequisite of any kind of aesthetic experience. And from this, she concludes that the enemies of the aesthetic are inattentiveness and mindlessness. Precisely the idea I want to challenge in this presentation. And well, here again I provide some other references to illustrate that REC is indeed widely assumed in the literature, despite, by the way, the multiple ways that everyday aesthetic experience is characterized in everyday aesthetics. However, I will also skip them to keep moving forward more quickly, but again, we can come back here later if you want. What I would like to call our attention to is a logical consequence that follows from REC, which is the exclusion of unreflective everyday experiences from the realm of everyday aesthetics. Indeed, this is a consequence that is often embraced by Saito. And as she puts it, if we follow REC, such habitual actions, we can exclude them from everyday aesthetics. The reason is precisely the lack of attention which places them under the conscious power. I emphasize this consequence because I find such exclusion worrying. My main concern has to do with the fact that such exclusion means neglecting a large part of everyday aesthetic subject matter itself, that is everyday life, since we ordinarily remain in a reflective attitude in everyday life, as said. But on the other hand, such exclusion worries me because the reflective attitude is a central feature of everydayness commonly alluded to by those who attempt to address the aesthetic character of everyday life ordinarily experienced, such as Haito herself, or Arto Apala, or Sinau Karinen, or Kevin Belchion, among others. Thus, faced with this challenge, I find it counterintuitive to dismiss reflective everyday experiences from everyday aesthetics. And in short, these are my main motivations in this article to challenge Reg. Moving on to the second part, I start by noting that this endeavor about challenging Reg is in line with what I call here the intuition on everyday aesthetics under the radar. And this refers to the idea, as mentioned before, suggested or assumed by some authors that everyday life is a aesthetic experience somehow reflectively. Despite the widespread assumption of Reg, I will show in this section, briefly, that such intuition appears recurrently in the literature, albeit in an underdeveloped form, sometimes even expressed by some authors who also endorse this Reg. At the same time, Pérez Carreño, or Paca, offers likely the clearest expression of this intuition when she claims that aesthetic perception also occurs inattentively in everyday life. As she writes, sunshine entering through the balcony was aesthetically perceptible also when it was unnoticed, that is, non-reflectively perceived. In her view, it is not that the object is aesthetically experienced only once it is attentively contemplated, as she says, but the object was from the beginning aesthetically perceived, if non-reflectively. It must be noted that Paca draws on Apala's work where the acknowledgement of this phenomenon is also present. He hints at it when he argues that the pleasure we derive from contemplating our familiar surroundings is not distinct from the pleasure we take in fulfilling the daily routines, but rather dependent on them. In this manner, as Paca emphasizes in her text, Apala assumes here that some aesthetic value is unreflectively present and experienced in routines, serving as the basis for, say, reflective everyday aesthetic experience. More recently, he made this clearer by referring to his previous work and claiming that ordinary everyday life provides us many quiet pleasures, which often go unnoticed, or elsewhere he also puts it more poetically, that the beauty of the everyday is a silent beauty that doesn't require our attention. And well, again, I bring here some references to briefly illustrate how recurrently this intuition appears in the literature. And although I believe that part of the value of my article lies in identifying this very intuition, as well as the generalized assumption of Reg, I will again skip these references, to move more quickly to the more argumentative part of the paper. But as you can see, among others, this intuition is expressed by Macarinian, Sir Irwin, Katia Mandoki, or even Yuriko Saito herself. So, the issue is that despite Reg, some authors have suggested or assumed that everyday aesthetic experience takes place somehow unreflectively. And certainly this intuition is manifested in varying senses and clarity by different approaches that even draw on different notions of the aesthetic, as is usual and sometimes a problem in everyday aesthetics, by the way. But in any case, it seems to me that all they share a common thing that seems to be an ordinary feature of our aesthetic relationship with everyday life. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, the intuition on everyday aesthetics under the radar hasn't been properly elaborated to explain the phenomenon in question, apart from merely stating it or taking it for granted, often only in passing when dealing with other topics. And as I see it, some relevant questions remain unanswered to make sense of it. Like what kind of perceptual experience would involve something like an unreflective everyday aesthetic experience? Or even more importantly, in what sense could we qualify a reflective everyday experience as aesthetic? In line with my purpose in this article, I am sympathetic to the outlined intuition, but if it is to be accepted, I think it needs further clarification. So, against this background, now I will proceed in 2 steps to make a case for this underdeveloped intuition, and thus to challenge Reg. My main argument, which broadens the focus of the issue, is based on a distinction between two senses of reflectiveness, or the reflective character of the experience. On the one hand, in line with Gray, there is a psychological sense of reflectiveness concerning the consciousness involved in the experience. In this sense, just as I can be conscious or unconscious of a certain perception, my attitude of admiring someone, for instance, can manifest itself consciously, as when I openly acknowledge my admiration for someone, or unconsciously, as when I take everything that the person I admire does or says as incontestable without being aware that I do so. But on the other hand, I argue that there is a normative sense of reflectiveness that is proper to aesthetic judgment, traditionally understood as an exercise of our rational agency. Following this sense, an experience has a normative character when there is room for the subject to endorse or make herself accountable or responsible for it. Accordingly, some experiences have no normative character because they are not subject to endorsement, for instance, enjoying a cool breeze, or do not imply an involvement of the subject, like, for instance, having an allergic reaction. On the other hand, other experiences have a normative character in involving the subject's rational commitment to one's experience. For instance, criticizing a behavior as pernicious or defending a film's excellence. Understood this way, then, to say that an experience is reflective wouldn't be so much a matter of the consciousness or attentiveness involved in it, but of endorsing one's own response as an appropriate response to have. Well, given this distinction, I consider that discussions in everyday aesthetics have focused too much on the psychological sense of reflectiveness when it comes to characterize everyday aesthetic experience, and instead I argue that the reflective character of everyday aesthetic experience should be reconsidered in terms of the normativity usually associated with aesthetic judgment. In this line, moreover, it is how I consider that the aforementioned intuition, everyday aesthetics and the radar, could be more easily explained. However, the first step of my argumentation has to do with the psychological sense of reflectiveness. Is attention necessary to perception? This has been a major topic of empirical and philosophical debate in perception theory for at least the last 2 decades. Under the broader formulation of whether attention is necessary for consciousness, the initial or traditional view has been that to consciously perceive something, it is necessary to pay attention to it. Roughly known as the gatekeeper hypothesis, this is the view of perception, I think, that seemingly underlies the reflective experience condition, as particularly illustrated at least by Saito's conception of everyday aesthetic experience as the experience where paying attention makes visible the ingredients of everyday life that remain invisible when conducting an autopilot. However, subsequent research in perception theory has since challenged this view by arguing that awareness survives attention, or in other words, that there is perception beyond attention, and in this way, it has also been considered that perception could also be inattentive. For extension reasons, I cannot go into detail here and do proper justice to the huge debate on this issue that actually continues to be discussed today. But here, what I would just like to note is that despite the huge debate on this issue in perception theory, discussions remains unsettled by currently available evidence and experimental approaches, at least as it is acknowledged by different positions in the literature. So, to the extent that this remains an open question, my point is simply that dread cannot be indicated, and thus that a psychological approach to everyday aesthetic experience based on attentiveness does not rely on solid ground, because there are no conclusive reasons to establish that perception must be attentive. Rather, as noted, the debate in perceptual theory shifted from the initial positions to consider the possibility of inattentive perception. And moreover, as underlying the intuition and everyday aesthetics under the radar, it has been shown that some positions also embrace this possibility in everyday aesthetics. But beyond descriptions of ordinary everyday experiences, from these authors in everyday aesthetics, some descriptions that might resonate with us, I consider that inattentive perception also seems plausible in the light of our ordinary behavior. As Aitor recognizes when describing the autopilot mode of conducting, we ordinarily interact efficiently with our environment, despite not paying attention to all the items surrounding us. So, well, she illustrates this with Dewey's words, saying that it is possible to be efficient in action, in this reflective action, because all obstacles are overcome by sharp skill. Well, this fact, by the way, although not without controversy to the extent to which cognitively control processes such as attentiveness and automatization, to which extent these kind of processes are involved, in skillful action, this fact is generally accepted by contemporary literature on the matter. The fact that we efficiently interact with our environment without much attention. But my point is that I consider this fact to suggest, at least, that certain elements must already filter in our reflective experience, before we pay attention to them, because otherwise, I think that my behavior would be different. I mean, I would probably navigate more unsuccessfully in my environment if I needed to attend to all the things that may be relevant to move through it safely. And then it seems to me unlikely that experience is contentless until attention intervenes. I'm likely here characterizing the issue, but I think that I'm just pushing to the direction that perception could also be inattentive. But although the possibility of inattentive perception is yet to be established, and it's not my aim here to do so, I just want to show that the tension we see in everyday aesthetics between dread and the intuition and everyday aesthetics and the relevant is rooted in two seemingly plausible views of perception that are currently under discussion in perception theory. And as said, also, despite I have pushed a bit to one direction, to be honest, the discussion between both views remains unsettled and in need of further clarification. In this context, a proper way to clarify the reflective character of everyday experience, understood as a matter of inattention, would require drawing on the vast literature on the issue in perception theory, I think, or at least I think that would be the best way to do so. However, until the question of the relationship between perception and attention is not settled within the field, I think that we should remain cautious in this regard. And whilst my argument points out that discussions in everyday aesthetics have been just too much in psychological terms, I also consider that everyday aestheticians, especially those who believe that everyday aesthetic experience requires attentiveness, should attend this debate. For the moment, as said, my point here is simply that dread cannot be vindicated because there are no conclusive reasons to establish that perception must be attentive. And moreover, as I will argue next, I consider that psychological considerations alone do not settle the question of everyday aesthetic experience in general. What is missing is a reason, I think, as to why everyday experience, reflective or not, should be considered aesthetic. So, continuing my main argument, now in the second step of my argumentation, in this presentation, I propose reconsidering everyday aesthetic experience and its reflective character in the terms of the normative reflectiveness usually associated with aesthetic judgment. According to this, as noted, what characterizes aesthetic judgment is that it involves the subject's commitment to one's response, that is, its rational character. And in Gorodetzky's words, this means that aesthetic judgment involves the subject's take on what is to be believed, felt, desired, or appreciated. Thus, in contrast to other kinds of affective responses, for instance, merely causally induced experiences or the manifestation of idiosyncratic preferences, what characterizes aesthetic experience is its normative character, whereby the subject is committed to her own affective response to an object's appearance as an appropriate response to her. And in this manner, still following Gorodetzky, aesthetic experiences are not episodes we undergo, but expressions of our reason's responsive capacity. In other words, aesthetic judgment is an expression of our rational agency. This agential dimension of aesthetic judgment is nicely expressed by Karat when she argues that aesthetic judgment is something that we do. Thus understood, aesthetic experience is something that we do, that is, it belongs to our rational agency to the extent that the self is normatively involved in one's affective response, that is, it carries the subject's commitment with it. And essentially, as in any essential attitude, like acting or believing, this entails that we are accountable for our aesthetic judgments or experiences. That is, we can be inquired about its normative grounds, just as we tend to demand and expect others to provide reasons for theirs. So, well, my point is that following this normative sense of reflectiveness, we have to reconsider everyday aesthetic experience to understand. And the point is that we have to understand it primarily in terms of the subject giving a particular affective conditional response to an object's appearance. In other words, as argued, as a response, as a kind of affective response, which we can or could account for, or for which we can or could give reasons for its appropriateness. In line with positions in everyday aesthetics that seek to preserve the core of our aesthetic discourse on art, such as that of Christopher Downing or Natxo himself, this conception preserves the normative aspect that is characteristic of aesthetic experience generally. That aspect that, in Dowling's words, quote, renders certain judgments of particular interest to others, and makes them the subject of agreement, amendment, and critical discussion. In this vein, as instantiated in artistic appreciation, what makes experience aesthetic in general is not so much the consciousness involved in it, I argue, but fundamentally its normative character. And indeed, following the normative sense, I think that we might even accommodate possible cases of artistic appreciation in which consciousness of perceived aspects will be pervasive. For instance, when the aesthetic experience of an artwork apparently involves, again, suggesting the possibility of intensive perception, unattended or diffusely attended elements, as I could amor to hazard, for instance. I think this is very often the case when, after our first encounter with an artwork, for instance, listening to a song, we are not able at that very moment to justify our aesthetic response, or at least to do so exhaustively. However, I don't think that this means that our response is ungrounded or inappropriate. Rather, as is often the case, I think that this is not until next encounters with the artwork that we recognize some of its aspects that initially went unnoticed to us, but which grounded our aesthetic response. For instance, a subtle change in rhythm when listening to a song. So, beyond the consciousness involved in these common cases, I think that what shows the aesthetic character of my experience here lies in the fact that when I realize such unnoticed aspects, I recognize them, even retrospectively, as normatively grounding the response I was having in the first place. That is, I appeal to them as reasons to account for my initial aesthetic response to the artwork as appropriate. Well, if following the normative sense of reflectiveness leads us to see everyday aesthetic experience in a different light, the intuition on everyday aesthetics under the radar should also be reconsidered along similar lines. Consequently, rather than conceiving it in psychological terms of unconsciously or semi-consciously grasping aesthetic aspects of everyday life, as is often the case, I argue that the phenomenon at stake is to be primarily understood as expressing one's aesthetic attitudes or responses in everyday life without being aware of doing so. That is, I'm talking here not so much about an awareness of having some perceptions, but primarily of doing something, of making some aesthetic judgments. Thus, it wouldn't be so much a matter of our presumably being able to perceive certain elements inattentively, but mainly of responding aesthetically to at least some of them and reflecting. To illustrate this phenomenon, that might seem a bit odd in the aesthetic, in this moment, I think, I think it would be illuminating to draw on an analogous case in the moral sphere. So let us consider the ordinary case provided by spontaneous attitudes, such as involuntary reactions to morally significant scenarios and the responsibility we attribute to them. And for that purpose, I propose the following example. Imagine a racist person sitting in the aisle seat of a bus, who instinctively clutches his bag in his arms just after noticing someone passing by him, someone presumably of the racial ethnicity targeted by his racism. Well, it is part of our ordinary moral intuitions to consider involuntary reactions such as this one, based on discriminatory basis, as significantly expressive of our subjectivity, probably due to their immediate character. And correspondingly, it is common to our ordinary moral practices to hold people such as the racist person morally accountable for involuntary reactions such as this one, even though they arise without any conscious or deliberate decision on our part. And as Angela Smith argues, this is because what makes an attitude ours is not that we have voluntarily chosen it or that we have voluntary control over it, but that it reflects our own evaluative judgments. Beyond the moral case, this shows that what matters in general when considering whether an experience belongs to our rational agency and thus whether we are accountable for it is not the extent to which we go through it deliberately or consciously, but rather whether it reflects a normative response on our part. And more importantly, for my purpose here, this also illustrates that expressing a normative response needn't be accompanied by the subject's awareness of doing so at a given moment. That is, it shows that we can express our rational agency without being aware that we are doing so. So at this point, I think that we might be in a better position to account for the intuition on everyday aesthetics and not rather properly considered. Elaborating on Pérez Carreño's example mentioned before, I will now recall the moment I was writing this text. So I imagine I am right now in my office, and while I am focused on writing this text, it seems plausible, as argued, though inattentive perception is yet to be established, that some aspect of my environment could figure inattentively in my overall experience. For instance, as a consequence of the crepuscular light streaming through the window, the warm golden illumination the room has acquired, or also the surrounding pattern of shadows generated by the curtain, to imagine some elements. And moreover, as shown by the moral case, I could also manifest a normative response to some of these aspects of such an atmosphere without being aware of doing so. Unlike the moral case, in this situation, my response would be an effective response, not a moral one, in such a way that, following Pérez Carreño's words, quote, that my activity was suffused with pleasure also during the time it was routine or unreflective. But why would this pleasure be aesthetic? That is, why my unaware affective response to such elements would be normative? Well, as in the alleged case of artistic appreciation, presumably involving unattended or diffusely attended elements, one would show the aesthetic character of my affective response in this situation, I think, that wouldn't be so much the consciousness involved in the experience, but its rational character. As argues, this means that, should I realize such unnoticed aspects, my unreflective experience would be deemed aesthetic to the extent that I recognize them, even retrospectively, as grounding the affective response I was having. That is, I would appeal to them as reasons to account for my initial affective response, instead of accounting for my pleasure in that situation, say, by appealing to my joy at having almost finished this text, or my relief at feeling warm by sunlight. In other words, my reflective everyday experience would be aesthetic insofar as my affective response expressed my rational agency, albeit unconsciously, and I could account for or be accounted for it afterwards. So, to sum up, this article explores the relationship between attentiveness and everyday aesthetic experience. And to do so, I first introduce the widespread assumption of rec. Second, I highlight the recurrent but underdeveloped intuition on everyday aesthetics and the rather in tension with rec. And against this background, I aim to challenge rec by distinguishing between a psychological and normative set of reflectiveness, as shown, and I argue that discussions in everyday aesthetics have focused too much on the former, while the latter is the relevant one when considering everyday aesthetic experience in general. The first conclusion of this article regarding psychological reflectiveness has been that REC cannot be indicated in light of the ongoing discussions in perception theory. On the other hand, the main conclusion of this article has been that we would do better by adhering to a normative sense of reflectiveness because, as argued, it is this one what makes an experience aesthetic in general. And also, the normative sense is preferable because it could allow us, granted that metacognitive perception is possible, to account for the intuition on everyday aesthetics and nirvana. In this way, we will not have to exclude a large part of everyday life from the realm of everyday aesthetics, and we would find the aesthetic character of ordinary everyday experience based on its characteristic and reflective attitude. Thank you very much for your attention.